So how's your church doing these days? Well, how are you doing these days? How are you doing in connection with your church these days? Half the people in North America who say they love Jesus say they don't love the church and they don't participate in church. Really hard to understand if you really pay attention to the New Testament that you could actually not participate with a group of believers. Now, it's really an open question to some degree as to how that group of people who are fundamentally believers with outsiders on the outside, observing, hanging on there. It could be big, it could be small, could be meeting in a rented space, could be meeting in somebody's recreation room in the basement of their house. There's lots of different possibilities for church. Now, one of the things that happened about 10 years ago is that the concept of being able to broadcast on the internet live became available. All you really need is one of these puppies and internet access, and away you go. And people said, oh, I got all these followers on Facebook, YouTube, or whatever it is. And many people have thought, wow, the church is doing extremely well. One of the mega churches, I just checked this recently, one of the mega churches in the U.S. that has multiple campuses has an attendance over 17,000, between 17,000 and 18,000. And they say they have 500,000 people, just under 500,000 people online every week. Well, you've got 17,000 meeting live, but you've got 500,000 that you're reaching out there. Well, are you really? How's the church doing? You know, the thing that most churches don't publish, and it bothers me a bit that they don't tell you the whole truth. The question is, how long, if they show up on your site and they click and they're counted as a viewer, how long do they stay? Well, they have to be there for a while before they're counted as a viewer. Do you know how long the while is? For Facebook, it's 3 seconds. For YouTube, it's 30 seconds. So whatever, people just breezing on by, they click in and out before they even hear a word. They're counted as a viewer, so that big number doesn't account for much. Now, we don't have a lot of statistics. It's available to the churches, those mega churches, and it's available to our church, as to your church as well. If you go on YouTube, I don't think Facebook has as good a stats as YouTube does, but you can know exactly how many viewers that you have and how long they stay. But I can tell you for sure, absolutely, unequivocally, that most people, no matter what it is, do not stay to the end. In fact, and we don't know because we just have to, it's not exactly, it's an educated guess. Let me put it that way. It's not exactly guessing. That they will participate somewhere between a quarter and a third. The stream will be going on their computer. Now, we don't know if they're feeding the dog or changing the baby, or whether they've gone out into the backyard to swing in the swing while the computer's still on. We don't know if they're actually there. We do know that it's highly likely that they have given divided attention. And if they showed up to go to church on time in their pajamas because it was more convenient for them, they're not going to stay to the end, except for rare exceptions. So what typically happens with these online presences is they have essentially two things that they do. One is compelling music, and the other is compelling preaching. And some of them, I do enjoy watching some of these guys who I pick up some things to say because they're clever and they're sincere, and there may be some charlatans out there doing church services, but I couldn't tell you which ones are. What I can tell you is that somewhere between a quarter and a third of the time that they're broadcasting, they're doing music. You know, they have the really cool live bands and the strobe lights, and well, not so much strobe lights when they're broadcasting, but lights coming and going, and all those sorts of things, and backup singers and lead vocalists. Excuse me. They got all that happening for the first quarter or third of the meeting, And the people who come at the beginning typically and are gone by the time it gets to the preacher. And then when the preacher gets up, typically, and I would do this too if I were in their context, they'd take maybe 3-5 minutes kind of warming the crowd up with maybe a joke or a story from their life so that they can become relatable to the people. And the people relate to that person on the platform, which may or may not be how that person behaves in person and behind the scenes. So all of this stuff that's going on that's saying, oh, we're reaching the world. COVID hit 2019, really 2020 before we really realized what was happening. And it lasted about 5 years. And so there was an explosion of churches that said, well, we got to do something if we can't meet. And some said, well, we're going to meet anyway and, stick our finger in the eye of the government that says we shouldn't be meeting. But they said, oh, we're going to go online instead. It didn't work. It wasn't working. But then again, how would you know that if you didn't know where the goalposts were? How do you know if you've scored or not? What I've told you is that those Facebook likes and those YouTube views mean almost nothing. But they don't mean nothing. Because in that framework, if you've got 1,000 views, you don't really, we've covered that, but you might have a few who are maybe just discouraged in life and they've got it there and there may be something that they see in the demeanor of the people who are leading the program or the responsiveness of the people as they do crowd shots and so on. And they might be saying, I think I need some of that. And that might be a gateway for someone to come to the Lord. We started broadcasting with Christian radio a very long time ago, before I was born. And there was a lot of good that came of it because people didn't have television when that started. And they would actually, apparently, stick with the program longer. But they're not doing it now. So how do we measure whether or not we're succeeding? How's your church doing? How are you doing in relation to your church? Well, we have to go back to first principles. We find those in the New Testament. So you can do this. You can go to one of your favorite AI platforms. Don't use Google for this. Use Google Gemini if you're going to do it. And ask your question. And make it an informative question saying, I'm just an ordinary person. You always have to tell it who you are so it knows how to position the answer. I'm an ordinary person in an ordinary church. And I'm just wondering what the Bible has to say about church. Well, you're really got to narrow that down to the New Testament. If you want to narrow it down, what did Jesus have to say about the church? In Mark, Luke, and John, nothing. Didn't use the word. Not as recorded. Now in Matthew, he did. And there's 2 references in Matthew that we need to look at and understand. And you can understand by implication when Jesus says something, that the outflow of that has to be big. Probably the passage that you know best is where Jesus said, I will build my church. Well, that tells you a lot of things. It tells you it's Jesus' church. It tells you that it's supposed to build, which implies growing internally and externally. And nothing, even the gates of hell are not going to stop it. And there's a great story of that it comes in connection with the Caesarea Philippi and the Gospels, and the gates of hell is a metaphor. Nothing's going to stop it. Okay, so we know that about the church. We know that if you got a problem, that ultimately you're supposed to ratchet up until you take it to the church. And so you have a responsibility amongst others. There's lots of things that we can learn from one verse in the Bible if we look at the obvious implications of it. But today what I'm going to do is give you a quick rundown of categories of what are in the church and mention most of the references with the word church. Now, that doesn't mean that it's everything about the church, because it could be, the family or the household that's used to describe the church. But just the word church, we're going to track that today. I'm going to put the verses on the screen for you. You're going to have to get your own Bible. I'm not going to give you very much of them, but I'll give you one that I find that it ought to stop us and make us think. Paul says to the church to Timothy, who's leading in the church, he says, you follow these 3 chapters up to now, and you will know how people ought to conduct themselves in God's household, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and foundation of the truth. I want you to kind of embed that in your background as we go through here and think about that. So Paul is saying to Timothy, there are rules of conduct. There are house rules, if you would, in this household, which is the church of the living God. It's not a human institution. It belongs to God. And it is the pillar and the foundation under the pillar of what? Of truth. So it is the church that is the dispenser of truth in the society. It's not the politicians. It's not the politicians who are supported by church people. It is the church that has been authorized by God to be the dispenser and holding up the truth that on a pillar with a strong foundation. So once you keep that in mind, then you have to ask some questions. Well, I need to remind you that today we're just going off the campus. Where normally speaking, normally it's become a little less normal in the last few weeks because so many things come up. We're working through the master plan of evangelism. Apparently Robert Coleman, who died a couple of years ago, sold 5 million copies of this book. It's a really, really good book. It tells you how Jesus worked with individuals. It doesn't say much, if anything, about the end result of the church. But Jesus said, that's where we're headed. I'm going to build my church. That's what's going to happen. Then he didn't talk about it. And he worked with his disciples so that they could have the character and the knowledge that was necessary for them to start the church. So we're going to go look at what the Bible says in the New Testament about some of the categories of church. Let's start with the word, Ecclesia. It's the Greek word. You sound really smart if you know that word. It's used over 100 times in the New Testament. It's used 3 times of what we would call a secular gathering. In one place, it's a mob is actually called the church. Now, you could think of that today as a group of protesters who are gathering together for a single purpose to be on the legislative steps and say, we want the laws changed, we want this, that, or the other thing. They're a single-purpose group, sometimes gathering on a one-off. But generally speaking, the word is used of a continuing kind of town hall, if you would, assembly that happens where the church gathers in a secular sense. That's only used 3 times in the New Testament. The universal church, which people love to talk about because it seems to give them an emotional buzz, is some of the references, definitely, there's no question it refers to the church worldwide, but there's only about 20 of those occurrences, and almost always, 80%, not 80%, but a little over 80% of the time, it is actually talking about a local group of people, not pretty, not in a great cathedral, never in a great cathedral in the New Testament. By and large, it would appear they met in homes, although you can't overemphasize that too much because they didn't always meet in homes. And so the idea that some will pick up that say, well, the house church is the way to go. Well, what you can take from that is that the churches in the New Testament are probably not very large. And the churches on average today in our world are not as large as people think they are. The reported attendance in the middle-sized church today is somewhere in the low 60s. And if you ask somebody how many people attend your church, and they'll give you an optimistic number. So I'm going to say 50 is a realistic number for kind of last week. It's how many people were there. But we also know that that is not the entire church in that particular locale, because even though they meet in that building that was once new in the 1950s, and now it needs tremendous repairs, and they don't know where they're going to get the money to put the new roof on it and so on. They got about 50 people attending, but there are about 100 people who would say, this is my church home. They may not be on the official membership roll, but they definitely identify with that particular local church as their church. On average, they attend 2 Sundays out of 5. Pastors don't like that idea because they like to do series. Well, if somebody's coming 2 out of 5, you better do a lot of repetition or make them available to them. And unless maybe you want to make them available online after the fact, not as live. Nothing wrong with doing it live because that's the quick and easy way to recording. But referring back to it, and some of the research that's been done recently would indicate that most of the people who watch church services online and consume most of it are people who are actually repeating what they saw live when they were there. It's quite interesting. They go to the same meeting twice. Why? Well, because they're not boring. See, sometimes people think that, well, you make it shorter, then it'll work. Well, tell that to Joe Rogan, who runs anywhere between 2 and 3 hours with his program several times a week. It's not the duration that's the problem. It's whether or not you're boring them or whether they think that it is important for their lives or the lives of the people around them, or so that it will give them the battery charge that they need. So on Sunday morning, if you're only charging your batteries 2 Sundays out of 5, how are your batteries going to be doing? How's your church doing? How are you doing in relation to your church? It needs to be paid attention to as to what's going on. Well, that's just a word of referring to the gathering, which typically in New Testament times was small, and typically today is not those mega churches we talked about earlier. Well, there are 4 words, going to rush through this, that talk about the main functions. I was going to say some of, there might be some other overlays that I'd want to put in there, so don't hold me to only 4. But these are key things that have biblical words in the Greek language in which it was written. Koinonia, the word that usually we think of as gathering together, fellowshipping with one another. You can't do that in your pajamas from the couch. It's not an observational thing. It's a relational thing, fellowship. Witnessing. We've lost this. The idea of being a martyr, martyrion, is the Greek word. The witness, making the gospel known in the house and out of the house, individually and collectively. Churches that fail do not invest outwardly in serving in their community, spreading the gospel in one way or another. Which way is the best way? The one you use is better than the one that you don't use. We used to go around handing out gospel tracts. I'm not against it. I don't know if it's the most effective thing. Sometimes there are new things that come up and people say, this is going to be the gold standard. This is going to be the method. This is going to be the way in which we're going to win Jesus. Not likely. Win people for Jesus. Not likely. It'll be marginally better than other things. You'll obviously have to keep up. We wouldn't have had those gospel tracts if Gutenberg hadn't have made the printing press popular. He didn't actually invent it. It had been done in China before, but I digress. Anyway, in the 1450s, the idea said, wow, we could put stuff on paper and multiple times without handwriting it. That was a big deal. And it went out there. And then we get this broadcasting thing that comes up 10 years ago and we say, wow, we can do that. You used to have to pay to put things on television. And now you don't. You just broadcast and everybody can get it. It's available to the whole world. Right now, this video is available to the whole world. And I can tell you for sure, the whole world isn't watching. Very few watch these videos. Why do I do them? For the 1, the 2, or the 3 that might make a modest difference in their life. And these videos will likely hang around long after I'm gone. They help somebody that I've never met, but I've gone home to glory. And, my job's to be faithful. I'm not in charge of the results department. I'm just doing the best that I can do going along in witnessing to the gospel. And then there's the idea of calling out the message. We use the word preaching, the emphasis on that which is preached more than the methodology. But it's the word used, Krigla is used 9 times. And it's talking about declaring what God has said to others. And Paul doesn't say, pray for the lost that they'll come to Jesus. He says, pray for me that I'll be bold and getting the message out using the methods I can. He did what Jesus did, went to the synagogues, which apparently had the most responsive people. He found the places to go. Maybe you want to go to Speaker's Corner somewhere. I'm in the midst with a good friend of talking about what we can do with podcasting that will capture the hearts of people in a dialogue mode. We think that we can do more and do better with it. And we won't know until we try, and we're not there yet. Got the equipment, but it's a matter of the focus and getting other things. If you have to stop doing something, if you're going to do something new. So we got to figure all that out. And then the fourth thing is the whole business of service. It's a word we have connected with the word deacon, as it should be. But it's the idea of practically serving people and doing things to help others. And if you're not helping inside your church and outside your church, then your church ain't much, no matter what. How's your church doing? How are you doing in connection with your church? If nobody else is serving in your church, well, it's really about you. You can't control them. Learned a long time ago, I can't make another person, not one other human in the world, do anything. They do it because they want to do it. Well, you light with a stick and force them into doing something momentarily, but as soon as you take the pressure off, they won't do it anymore. Trying to get people to witness because they have to makes for a very cold witness. And in the end of the day, they might quit on you, and the people that they reach probably are not going to follow either. So those are some of the main functions that the New Testament talks about in the church. Now, moving forward, there are verses in the Bible, we'll rush through most of these things, about the identity and ownership of the church. It's Jesus' church. The idea of the word church in this context is used in Matthew 16 that we quoted before, and Paul uses it in connection with the church in Corinth. It belongs to Christ alone. It has to be an entity that is built outwardly. It exists for the people who aren't part of it yet. Did you catch it? The church exists for the people who aren't part of it yet. There's this outward focus. But then when they come in and see, Jesus said, they're going to get it because they see that you love each other. So there's also an advancing of the community and the individual lives on the inward, on the inside. But it is advancing outward into more and more people. Now, churches lose about 10% of their people every year, 10 to 15% every year, and they fill up with 10 to 15% people who happen to come because they used to go to church in the other community, perhaps. But almost all people who come to church come because somebody invites them. It's not complicated. Television ads and live broadcasting on the internet are not going to do it unless an individual is connected with those people and maybe uses those tools in connection with them. There is this distinction between the universal and the local church. It always bugs me when the guy at the Christian rock concert gets up there and says, "Church, let's all sing together." And they say, there is a universal sense of the church, but many of those people who love that music will not, on Saturday night, won't be gathering with a local group of ordinary believers without the endorphins flowing through their brain, without great excitement on Sunday morning, just because they serve one another and they love one another, and they might not feel like it, but they just show up and they do their thing, and they control themselves. And if they go to the concert and not get to church Sunday morning, then that's kind of a foggy use of the word church. It's got to motivate people to belong to others and to change. And love defines the identity, not the structure, but the love that's in the house. Now, in the New Testament, we have house-based gatherings, not often mentioned as much as we think it is, although we have evidence for sure that there was a lot going on in houses. These were small relational communities that were preferred. If you read the book of Acts at the beginning, it talks about the believers, 3,000 newbies baptized on one day, but they scatter into the houses out in the community. I don't know how they organized it. I'm not sure they did. But one person connected with another person and had them over for a meal, and they did stuff just like a family would to encourage each other going forward. And there are some times in the New Testament when a citywide identity is mentioned, and it would appear that this church identity in a city where there were multiple outposts within one geographical location was normal. And these identifiable gatherings had local leadership. That's important for us to understand. It was not organized by some great power out here that told them what to do. They might have used resources from somewhere out there, but it is locally led. And that, if to be a church and to really be significant, there's got to be a connection between the local leadership all the way through to everybody who's involved. And that leadership is demonstrated in the book of Acts and also in a few other places, that the church had more than one leader. And even when there was new believers, they had multiple. The term that's most common in the New Testament is elder. The term we use is pastor. It's only used once in the New Testament. So these are people who are there, who are elected, appointed. Doesn't say how, except that Paul says, just go and make sure they're set up there. And they have a shared leadership. It's not, it all revolves around one guy. What he says goes. It's a shared leadership. They have things that they're doing together. Teaching is important. That's part of what would fit within the word fellowship, is in my view. But teaching matters. And prayer matters. The breaking of bread mattered to them. This ceremony that Jesus instituted to memorialize himself, and how you do that and when you do it. And it was important enough that when Luke wrote the history, he mentioned it. And they were daily sharing life together around food. I've come to understand over the decades that food is really important. Obviously, we have to eat. But when people are sharing food together, it seems to be a kind of a lubricant to make them relax and share a bit one with the other person, not being forced to say, and what's your opinion? And what's your opinion? And what's your opinion? It's a free flow conversation. And these are some of the core things that they were doing in the New Testament. So it was participatory. This was not platform driven. We built churches with platforms, lights, and even turn off the house lights. I really dislike that. That's a personal preference more than anything, but I think it hurts the fact that I need to relate to the people around me. One of the guys that I enjoy watching, don't like everything he says, but one of the guys I enjoy watching says, turn to somebody beside you and say so-and-so and such and such. And it's a little hokey in my mind, but I get a kick out of it. But he's trying to get people to realize that they have to relate to each other and participate. I think it's really hard when you're in a big arena to get people participating. Why would you do that? I don't know where the motivation comes from. And it's got to be built on what people can understand in their own language, in their own way, at their own level. The New Testament talks about the fact that we assemble together, and we shouldn't stop doing it. And does mention, only on a few occasions, that singing occurs in the community. And I think, why do we give a third of our time to singing? That doesn't resonate with the New Testament pattern. And singing, it's good. It's a great group exercise, and it helps us concentrate a bit. But, too much, maybe too much. This is a community that's recognized. Other people recognize. It's not a secret thing. It's like, oh, there's that group over there. And they had fear that things were going to go wrong because they did have governmental problems. I get bent out of shape when I see people worrying about what the government's going to do to take us over. We have no idea what the New Testament church had to endure, or in many countries have to endure. And they faced difficult times, but they were definitely insiders and outsiders. I wish I had more time to talk about that. They made decisions together. My favorite illustration is in Acts 6. They got a problem with serving food to widows, and they participate with all the disciples helping to come up with a decision. It doesn't come down from on high and say, starting next week. No, they get to set aside the leaders who are going to help with that. And it's no question that the New Testament had this kind of community that worked together and related to one another. It was very much a discernment from all of them, not just top down. I think it's very important that we teach believers, new and old alike, that they have to respond to this their own spirit inside and their conscience as guided by the Holy Spirit. And if they say, why don't we do this or that? Then they need to be kind of reined in by those who are more mature. Explain things to them, not telling them, no, we can't do it that way because it's just not the way we do it. But that brings them to the place where they say, I used to think this, but I came to believe that doing it this other way is the best way for us and our life and our community. The church was, without question, relationally dense. These people had more friends than the other people in the community, hands down, no doubt about it. And if you read Romans, I find it fascinating that Romans, Paul gives a long list of people. He had never been to Rome, but he knew these people by reputation, by maybe lettered communication or whatever. He knew these people, and he speaks highly of them, name by name by name, but half of them women, but half of them men. They're sharing. They were sharing between churches. A big theme, a thread that weaves through the New Testament, is Paul collecting money for the suffering church in Jerusalem. It was suffering because of the Jewish leadership, and they'd been cut off from their Jewish families, many of the people, and money from the outside, from churches. Paul says in the Macedonian church, out of extreme poverty, gave to help the church in Jerusalem. I tell you, Macedonia, you can look it up. Macedonia is a long way from Jerusalem, but they cared and they shared. And the church in Thessalonica had become known across the whole region because of the way in which they related to one another. The church had discipline. You could remove people from the church that didn't obey. It's kind of like, you can't tell me what to do. Well, yeah, we can. Collectively, we can. The gathered church does exercise discipline when it's rightly formed. And the boundaries are clearly set by the Scripture. There's the mission, the church in Antioch sends out 2 of its best elders, 2 out of 5. 40% of its leaders sends them off to go and start churches elsewhere. They're setting an example to others, and their faith becomes known. And people say, hey, that ragtag group over there, they're making a difference in that community. And they suffered because of it, because whenever you're doing something good, somebody's going to come and get you. The outsiders couldn't grasp it, but some did, and they came to faith. So this suffering is a theme that's woven throughout the New Testament. Shouldn't surprise you if your church is suffering. How's your church doing? Well, should have some difficulties and some suffering if it's normal. It's Jesus who will evaluate how we're doing. So those are some of the themes that talk about the church. And any church that wants to ignore those themes is ignoring the church that the New Testament describes. There is a structured presence. It's not just, well, we'll get together if we feel like it. And somebody from the outside coming in and slapping up posters and saying, come and hear my band. I'm not against coming to hear the band, but that's not church. There's insiders and outsiders. I don't know how they organized their church membership, but there was definitely a sense in which these are the people who are members, and they have a role in expressing themselves. Maybe not in the main public meetings, but they're taken very seriously from the youngest to the oldest. There are established rules. That's where we started for that passage from Timothy, how people ought to conduct themselves, how they ought to behave. So obviously there was rules that demonstrated what it took to belong and have the identity of being a part of the church and conducting themselves. And the base is always the church, which is the pillar and ground of church. We've had the development over the last few generations of what we call parachurch. Para means alongside of. Parachurch organization. We said, well, the church isn't getting it done, so we'll start an organization. And that overall has not proven to be a good thing. The church has not done well over the last 100 years. And largely, the energy and the money gets siphoned off into parachurch organizations that look more exciting and more valuable. But while they might get people to raise hands, how much do they get involved in the local church? Very best way, without question, is one person telling another person, one beggar telling another beggar where to find bread. And you can be proud of your church, your very ordinary church that maybe has 50 people on Sunday. And yeah, maybe they're a little older, but sometimes older people are the nicest people. As long as they'll relate, and young people want to have a grandmother talking to them. They're a little awkward about it, obviously. Children love it when somebody pulls a candy out of their pocket and hands it to them and demonstrates that they belong or that they're one. The church has a tremendous capacity that's unleashed by the power of the Spirit of God. But as long as you keep it bound up and don't extend beyond recognizing the church exists for the people who aren't there yet, then you're missing the boat. And that's what Colin was talking about in this evangelism, master plan of evangelism, was getting this ragtag group of 12 kind of restructuring their psyche so that they understood how to relate to people. When Jesus worked out in his ministry fields, he traveled from place to place. We have no evidence that he settled down. Well, he settled down in Capernaum, but that he started a church, a group. He was moving from town to town and place to place, but he was talking to more individuals in small groups than he ever did preach sermons. Only about 20% of the time do you have in the New Testament anything recorded that we might call a sermon today. And we need to learn how to relate to people better. We need to learn how to be bold with people better. We need to learn how to reach beyond and establish a connection with people who might be interested. Most are not at the beginning, but if you infect somebody's life and they really truly change, and the others around them will say, what's gotten into you? And you teach them how to say, actually, it's my relationship with Jesus through the people of Jesus in such and such a church. I never heard of that. Where's your church building? Well, we don't have a church building. We're meeting in a basement. We're meeting in a restaurant. We're meeting in a community center, wherever it is. Don't disparage your church just because it doesn't have 3 acres of building and a steeple on it. That's not the church. The church is the people. And that facility, you got to meet somewhere. Particularly in cold climates, you can't meet outside all year round. So you've got to give yourself to the life of your church individually. Don't worry about the parachurch stuff. I'm not saying cancel your involvement there, but don't let it suck you